to Melanated Melodies. My name is Sarah Ramson. My introduction prelude was Mary was the Queen of Galilee. It is the first movement of a suite called The Ceremony of Spirituals, composed by Maurice Strong, a modern African-American composer and a native of Detroit, Michigan. Melanated Melodies is a tribute to African-American composers. Many African-American composers in the early 20th century struggled to be recognized for their accomplishments, and some of those who became world-renowned artists in their day are not remembered today. African-American composers have changed the course of classical music for centuries, even if they have not been afforded the spotlight they deserve. I would like to highlight some of the African-American composers that I have explored. Most of their arrangements are written for orchestra. This is my interpretation, arranged for solo harp. These composers had a great deal in common. They were African-American, classically trained composers who combined African-American sounds with European and Western structure. They wrote compositions based on Negro spiritual themes from the Black church, choosing to embrace their roots instead of writing music that strictly adhered to a more Eurocentric tradition. First, I will perform Adoration by Florence Price. Born in Little Rock, Arkansas in 1887, Florence Beatrice Price was an African-American classical composer, pianist, organist, and music teacher. Florence Price became the first female composer of African descent to have a symphonic work performed by a major national symphony orchestra. Adoration was one of her last compositions before her death in 1953. Next, I will perform Brown Girl by William Grant Still. Born in 1895 in Woodville, Mississippi, at the age of 15, he began violin lessons and taught himself to play clarinet, saxophone, oboe, bass, cello, and viola. He was the first African-American to conduct a major American symphony orchestra, the first African-American male to have a symphony performed by a leading orchestra, the first African-American to have an opera performed by a major opera company, and the first African-American to have an opera performed on national television before his death in 1978. William Grant Still's Brown Girl is his fourth selection from the Black Belt Suite composed in 1926. Margaret Bonds was a classically trained pianist, composer, and arranger. Born in 1913, she studied with Florence and she is best remembered today for her popular arrangements of African American spirituals and frequent collaborations with many poets such as Langston Hughes, during which she set his poetry to music. I will perform The Bells. It is the second selection from the spiritual suite of Margaret Bonds. perform a tribute to the composition Troubled Water by Margaret Bonds from her spiritual suite for piano. Margaret Bonds passed away 4 years before the advent of the Copyright Act, greatly affecting her estate's intellectual property rights to her original music. Therefore, many of her manuscripts were lost after the time of her death. Due to the restrictions that women of color had during her lifetime, the majority of Ms. Bonds' works were unrecorded or lost both during her lifetime and after her death. James Weldon Johnson, born in 1871, was a civil rights activist who originally had sought to write a poem in commemoration of Abraham Lincoln's birthday. However, amid the ongoing civil rights movement, Johnson decided to write a poem which was themed around the struggles of African Americans following the Reconstruction era. John Rosamond Johnson, his younger brother, born in 1873, began playing the piano at 4 years old. Mr. John Johnson set his older brother's poem to music. It premiered in the year 1900. My final selection will be Lift Every Voice and Sing. These composers were not only skilled musicians, but possessed great imaginative and expressive capabilities in literature as poets. They demonstrated courage, strength, and grace in response to discrimination. The musical details in their bodies of works tell stories of suffering, longing, and hope. Musicians possess the power to amplify forgotten voices. I hope I have inspired you today to explore the remarkable stories of African American composers who achieved success during the early 20th century despite the obstacles they faced because of their race and gender, but whose neglected music deserves much wider recognition. Thank you.